Freedom is never handed down like a gift wrapped in ribbon. It is taken, demanded, wrestled from the hands of those who profit from control. 6 decades ago, Martin Luther King Jr. spoke those words about the struggle of African Americans. Today on African soil, they return with new fire. The continent of 1,400,000,000 people has long been forced to send every message, every payment, every search query across oceans before it circled back home. Imagine mailing a letter to your neighbor, but first shipping it to another continent. That was Africa's digital reality for decades. And yet, out of this frustration, a voice rose. Ibrahim Traoré, a soldier turned leader, dared to speak of sovereignty not only in land or gold, but in the invisible wires of knowledge itself. He asked a question few wanted to face. If Africa can claim its soil, why not also claim its servers? Stay with us. This is not just another headline. It is a turning point history will remember. Subscribe now and walk with us through the journey of sovereignty. For decades, Africa's digital lifelines were leased, not owned. Every time a student in Nairobi searched for the Mali Empire, their query detoured through servers in Paris or Seattle before looping back. Every time a farmer in Ouagadougou tried to check weather forecasts, he was paying silent tolls to foreign shareholders. The architecture was absurd. A neighbor's message routed across the Atlantic before it returned 2 streets away. It was more than inefficiency. It was dependence, hard-coded into cables and contracts. The result was cruel. Africa, a continent brimming with young coders, farmers, teachers, and dreamers, paid some of the highest internet costs in the world. Families spent a disproportionate share of income to keep children online. Doctors in rural clinics debated whether they could afford to upload patient records. Entrepreneurs watched their ideas wither because bandwidth was too costly, too slow, too foreign. This was not progress. It was digital colonialism hidden beneath glossy apps and cloud services. Then came a disruption. In late 2022, Ibrahim Traoré, still in his 30s, began speaking of sovereignty in terms that startled his listeners. He declared that true independence was not only about who mined the gold beneath the soil, but also about who owned the data flowing through the fiber. His words carried the cadence of defiance. Dependence ends the day we decide it ends. The African Union soon translated conviction into blueprint. The plan was audacious. 100,000 kilometers of fiber optics across deserts and jungles, 47 new data centers, and a protocol deliberately incompatible with Silicon Valley's monopoly. The project was christened the Continental Internet Exchange. To skeptics, it sounded like a fantasy. Too expensive, too risky, too technical for nations still battling poverty. But beneath the doubts, belief began to spread. Engineers from Lagos, policymakers from Dakar, students from Nairobi, they all recognized the same wound: high costs, slow speeds, and a system designed to silence. The vision was not merely technological, it was civilizational. No longer would Africa be the tenant on someone else's digital estate. It would be the architect of its own highways of information. The language of sovereignty, once reserved for land, borders, and minerals, was now applied to servers, cables, and code. The contrast was striking. For over 2 decades, American corporations collected billions from Africa each year. Google shaped what people discovered. Microsoft dictated cloud access. Amazon controlled transactions. They were not just service providers. They were custodians of Africa's knowledge, toll collectors at every digital intersection. Now, a small, landlocked country, led by one of the world's youngest heads of state, dared to rewrite the rules. Traore offered his people 2 roads. The first was familiar: safety through dependence. Under that path, Africa would continue paying inflated fees, tolerate delays, and accept a narrative filtered through foreign servers. The second was new and untested: risk and freedom. It meant building an infrastructure from scratch, provoking resistance from powerful interests, and absorbing the cost of innovation. But it also meant jobs for African engineers, opportunities for startups, and dignity woven into every byte of data. The stakes were immense: $50 billion a year. Money that once leaked out of the continent into foreign services could circulate within African economies. Each connection was more than bandwidth. It was a chance to plant the seeds of innovation at home. A student downloading a textbook in seconds, a farmer trading harvest prices in real time, a doctor sharing patient scans without surveillance. These were not abstractions. They were glimpses of liberation. Still, history had taught Africans to be cautious. Colonialism did not only seize land, it built mental architectures of doubt. The idea that Africa could not build, could not innovate, could not sustain. Breaking cables was one thing. Breaking chains in the mind was another. The true battle was psychological as much as technological. And so, as fiber was laid and centers rose, the world watched with skepticism. Western analysts dismissed it as symbolic. Commentators predicted delays, corruption, failure. Yet on the ground, determination hardened. For those who had grown up invisible in global digital networks, the project was more than infrastructure. It was recognition. The moment of truth approached. Would the switch flip successfully? Would Africa's data finally stay within its borders? Or would the dream collapse under its own ambition? The question lingered. Was this merely a daring vision on paper, or the spark of a revolution that would upend the global digital order? When the first cables lit up, the story shifted from theory to confrontation. What had once been speeches in Ouagadougou became a network pulsing across a continent. Overnight, millions began migrating to the new system. Within 3 days, more than 200 million Africans connected to their own internet, a pace faster than Facebook, TikTok, or WhatsApp had ever achieved. The symbolism was thunderous. For the first time in digital history, Africans were not passengers on somebody else's platform. They were drivers steering their own road. Silicon Valley did not applaud. It panicked. Executives at Google convened emergency meetings. Microsoft's engineers discovered their crawlers could not index the new protocol. Amazon's cloud failed to penetrate the system. By design, the monopoly was severed at the root. For companies accustomed to dictating the digital pulse of entire continents, the shock was existential. Western governments echoed the alarm. In Washington, policymakers debated whether sanctions could be justified under the banner of digital security. Paris raised the specter of instability, framing the shift as reckless rather than revolutionary. London worried aloud about losing cultural influence, fretting that the English language itself could lose dominance online. Headlines across Europe warned of a splintered internet, as if Africa's sovereignty were a threat to global stability. But on the ground, in the places that mattered, the reaction was joy. In Nairobi, students streamed lectures without interruption. In Lagos, businesses slashed transaction costs as payments no longer detoured through Europe. In Ouagadougou, journalists found African history appearing first in their search results, not buried under Napoleon or colonial footnotes. For ordinary families, the revolution was immediate. Cheaper access, faster speeds, and dignity restored. Traore's rhetoric crystallized into lived experience. "Dependence ends the day we decide it ends," he declared. The line spread across the continent like fire. Painted on walls, chanted in student rallies, shared as hashtags, it became the anthem of a generation. For young Africans, it was more than words. It was proof that the invisible walls of digital dependency could crack. Yet the higher the hopes, the stronger the resistance. Western analysts doubled down, calling the experiment unsustainable. Lobbyists from Silicon Valley pressured African governments, warning of instability, instability, repeating the word like a curse. Could local engineers truly manage billions of daily transactions? Could African universities train enough specialists to maintain data sovereignty? Fear, doubt, uncertainty. These were the weapons deployed from abroad. The paradox deepened. The same West that celebrated its own sovereignty branded Africa's attempt as dangerous. The same powers that built firewalls around their industries now condemned Africans for building cables of their own. For Traore, the hypocrisy only confirmed his cause. Sovereignty, he argued, was never gifted. It was seized, built, defended, whether in soil, in gold, or in data. Inside Africa, voices clashed too. Some civil society groups warned against new monopolies at home. They cautioned that sovereignty must not become a shield for governments to silence dissent. Others insisted that transparency and safeguards could ensure freedom and responsibility traveled together. The debate was intense, but it was also evidence of something new. Africans were finally debating their own future, not one imposed by distant corporations. The turning point arrived with the numbers. 200 million users in 3 days. $50 billion kept within African economies instead of flowing abroad. 47 data centers across capitals. 100,000 kilometers of fiber glowing beneath the soil. Statistics became symbols, proof that the revolution was not just poetic, but practical. And yet, even as celebrations erupted, the shadow loomed. Silicon Valley was wounded, but not powerless. Washington was wary, but not silent. Paris was displeased, but not resigned. The question was not whether Africa had succeeded in breaking free. The question was whether it could endure the pressure that was surely coming. Would the world's youngest leader and his continent of dreamers withstand the storm that now gathered? Or would the weight of global resistance crush this fragile freedom before it could take root? The cables were not just metal and glass. They were veins carrying new lifeblood into African societies. Almost immediately, the ripple effects of the continental internet exchange reached classrooms, markets, clinics, and parliaments. What once felt like distant rhetoric became lived reality. In schools from Dakar to Kampala, students experienced what older generations had only dreamed of: uninterrupted access to knowledge. A textbook that once took minutes to download now appeared in seconds. A lecture that once froze midstream now flowed smoothly. For the first time, African history surfaced first in search results, digitized oral traditions standing alongside global archives. The classroom was no longer mediated by foreign servers. It belonged to Africa itself. Farmers in Burkina Faso felt the shift too. Through locally built applications, they could compare crop prices in real time, negotiate fairly, and reduce the grip of middlemen. Faster and cheaper connectivity meant more than convenience. It meant food on the table, dignity in labor, and a sense that the soil beneath their feet finally spoke the same digital language as their hands. Clinics in rural Kenya shared patient scans without relying on foreign surveillance. Doctors could collaborate with colleagues across the continent securely, building networks of care that had once been impossible. For families, the cost of staying online dropped, freeing income for essentials like food and education. These were not abstract changes. They were daily acts of liberation. Economically, the numbers told their own story. $50 billion once drained from Africa every year no longer disappeared into Silicon Valley's coffers. Instead, it began to circulate at home. Data centers hired African engineers. Fiber networks employed local labor. Startups sprouted, funded not by foreign investors dictating terms, but by local wealth kept within the continent. Sovereignty was no longer just a political claim. It was an economic engine. Politically, the impact was profound. Traore had tied digital sovereignty to a broader struggle: control over mines, farms, and knowledge. For decades, Africa had been told it was too dependent, too divided, too underdeveloped to manage its own future. Now, with fiber humming beneath the soil, those arguments cracked. Sovereignty was no longer a speech delivered on a podium. It was infrastructure running beneath people's feet. Yet the revolution carried its own dangers. Civil society warned that sovereignty must not become a license for censorship. Owning the cables meant owning the switch, and that power could be abused. Some governments saw an opportunity to centralize control, to decide which voices were amplified and which were silenced. Activists raised their voices, reminding leaders that freedom without accountability was just another form of bondage. Still, the symbolism endured. Across African cities, murals appeared with slogans like "Our data, our destiny." Youth groups organized hackathons not only to build apps, but to protect the integrity of their new system. For the first time, sovereignty felt participatory. It was not a decree from above, but a collective movement. Beyond daily life, this shift reshaped identity. Generations who had grown up invisible online now saw themselves reflected. Searching Burkina Faso independence no longer yielded pages of European commentary, but African scholarship, oral histories, native languages. This was more than search results. It was dignity restored. The spirit of anti-colonial Africa pulsed again, not through rifles or protests, but through cables and code. A new generation understood sovereignty not as nostalgia for past struggles, but as a living, evolving responsibility. They saw themselves as heirs not of defeat, but of resilience. Every byte of data kept within their borders was a line of resistance against centuries of extraction. Yet the test of time remained. Building was one challenge. Sustaining was another. Could Africa maintain discipline, resist corruption, and invest continuously in innovation? Would governments respect transparency, or would temptation bend the tools of freedom into instruments of control? The revolution had begun, but revolutions are judged not on their spark, but on their endurance. The question now was stark. Would this new Africa prove capable of carrying sovereignty with integrity, or would the same forces of greed and pressure undo the fragile independence it had just won? Beyond the borders of Africa, the reverberations grew louder. In Washington, policymakers convened urgent sessions, their language cloaked in the vocabulary of cybersecurity and global stability. Sanctions were floated, not openly declared but whispered in corridors of power. The logic was familiar. When a continent once deemed dependent asserted control, the response was suspicion. Paris and London were equally unsettled. For France, the loss of digital influence echoed deeper wounds. Centuries of cultural dominance, once reinforced by language and narrative, now faced disruption. French officials fretted that Francophone Africa might one day prefer its own platforms, its own voices, its own digital destiny. In London, headlines spoke of fragmentation, portraying Africa's sovereignty as a threat to unity rather than a correction to imbalance. Yet outside the Western orbit, the echoes carried a different tune. In South America, leaders studied Africa's model and considering whether regional internet exchanges could free them from northern monopolies. In Asia, governments experimenting with sovereign networks found validation. Africa had proven the impossible possible. The narrative shifted from isolation to inspiration. Global media scrambled to interpret. Technology reporters admitted that no adoption curve in Silicon Valley's history had matched 200 million users in 3 days. Analysts who once dismissed the initiative as symbolic now conceded it had teeth. A continent long cast as a consumer had become a creator, and that reversal unsettled the guardians of the old order. The debate crystallized into two camps. For some, Africa's choice was reckless, a splintering of the internet that endangered global communication. For others, it was overdue, a rightful correction against decades of monopoly. At the heart of it was the same contradiction. Why is sovereignty celebrated in Europe or America? Oh, my sovereignty America. But branded as destabilizing when practiced in Africa? For Ibrahim Traoré, the answer was clear. Sovereignty was not a slogan to be granted or denied by outside powers. It was a birthright to be exercised. His stance became a rallying cry not just for Burkina Faso but for a generation of Africans who saw in the cables beneath their soil a tangible expression of freedom. The phrase African sovereignty moved from think tank reports into hashtags, graffiti, and everyday speech. Still, the storm gathered. Could Africa withstand the diplomatic pressure, the lobbying of trillion-dollar corporations, the narratives spun by Western media? The world was watching, some with admiration, others with anxiety, as a continent of dreamers rewrote the script of digital power. The question lingered in every capital. Was this the dawn of a multipolar digital age? Or would Africa's sovereignty be strangled before its roots could deepen? The launch of Africa's internet was not an end. It was a beginning, fragile, contested, but alive. The road ahead stretched into two possible horizons, each demanding vigilance. On one side lay the risks. Powerful nations would not easily surrender the leverage they had enjoyed for decades. Pressure could come in many forms. Sanctions disguised as security, trade barriers masquerading as regulation, or covert attempts to fracture the network from within. Internally, the danger was equally real. Governments might be tempted to use the new digital sovereignty as a tool of surveillance, tightening control instead of liberating voices. Corruption could drain resources meant for maintenance and innovation, leaving infrastructure vulnerable. On the other side lay opportunity. For the first time, Africa could weave sovereignty into the very fabric of daily life. Engineers trained on African soil could become global innovators. Startups could thrive without being swallowed by foreign platforms. Economies could retain wealth, circulating billions at home instead of exporting them abroad. Civil society could embed transparency into the system, ensuring that freedom was not only proclaimed but practiced. The symbolism was powerful. For centuries, Africa's riches, gold, cotton, cocoa, oil, had flowed outward. Now even the invisible wealth of data had been leaving. With the continental internet exchange, that flow reversed. Knowledge, money, and opportunity began to circulate inward, strengthening roots rather than draining them. The revolution was no longer only about independence. It was about dignity. For Ibrahim Traoré, the challenge was to remind his people that sovereignty was not a moment but a discipline. It required patience, accountability, and the courage to resist both external threats and internal temptations. True freedom was not simply declaring independence but proving capable of sustaining it. The imagery resonated deeply. The cables beneath the earth were seeds, planted in soil watered by sweat and belief. The harvest was still to come, but already glimpses of it could be seen. A student streaming her lessons without interruption, a farmer trading fairly, a doctor collaborating securely. Each act, small in isolation, formed part of a grander season of liberation. Africa had chosen risk and freedom over safety and dependence. The road was uncertain, but it was theirs. And for the first time, the world was not only watching Africa struggle, it was learning from it. The question now was universal. If one small, landlocked nation could ignite a digital revolution, what might the rest of the world dare to build for its own sovereignty? The story of Africa's internet revolution is not just about cables and servers. It is about dignity carried in every byte of data, about sovereignty made visible in the glow of fiber beneath the soil. For generations, Africans were told that independence was too costly, too complex, too fragile. And yet, against every prediction, a new chapter has begun. In Ouagadougou, the lights of data centers shine like beacons, proof that sovereignty is no longer confined to speeches. In Nairobi, students stream lessons uninterrupted, seeing their own history reflected first in the search bar. In Lagos, entrepreneurs watch wealth circulate at home, no longer siphoned to foreign giants. Each of these moments may appear ordinary, but together they form a declaration. Africa is no longer asking permission. The spirit of anti-colonial Africa breathes again, not through rifles or barricades, but through fiber optics and code. It reminds us that freedom is not handed down. It is claimed, built, and defended. Traore's words echo across the continent. Dependence ends the day we decide it ends. For many, this is not just rhetoric. It is lived reality, a new form of sovereignty rooted in discipline, not defiance alone. The implications stretch beyond one continent. In Europe, in Asia, in the Americas, people now ask, if Africa can reclaim control over its digital lifelines, what stops us from rethinking our own? Sovereignty, once seen as the domain of borders and armies, now extends to data, algorithms, and the hidden architecture of modern life. The cables under the oceans and the servers in distant cities are as political as any parliament. At rallies and in classrooms, the message condenses into words that fit on banners and hashtags. Our hands, our life, our future. It is not a slogan of isolation, but of resilience. It is a promise that what began as anti-colonial Africa has matured into African sovereignty, tangible and undeniable. If this story touched you, do not let it fade. Share it, comment, and add your voice. Subscribe to walk with us into the next chapter, because history is not written only by leaders, but by those who choose to witness and to remember.